If you were to compare global population, say from the year 1950 to the year 2015, population grew threefold from 2.5 billion to 7.2 billion. However, if you were to ask by how much did plastic production grow, it grew 190-fold from 2 million tons to over 380 million tons. And so there are, and that was per year. And so plastic production increased greatly. But one of the things about plastic was that it is resistant to decomposition. And so then much of it lasts for years and years after its production. About 10% of this amount has been recycled. About 10% of it has been incinerated. The overwhelming majority of it, however, then has not been either recycled or incinerated, and now is accumulating as waste, either polluting the environment or the ocean. The year 2018 was a primary importer of recyclable plastics throughout the world, taking many recyclables. So recycling centers sent all of their material and bulk to China. But in 2018, China decided it would no longer accept plastic waste from other countries. And this then was a problem because, everyone was recycling, but the recycling had nowhere to go. There were some arrangements made with additional countries to accept the recycling waste that China no longer was. But one of the problems was these other countries, might have had some capacity, but not sufficient, were often overwhelmed. And so then there were scenarios where materials which weren't thrown into landfills, say in the United States, were, quote, recycled. They were sent overseas to other countries which accepted for contracts, we can accept your recyclable waste, but then they were simply discarded in the environment where they caused environmental degradation, contaminated groundwater, et cetera, in other countries. And so the world is then scrambling to come up with new ways of recycling its waste. Enormous resolution. Something known as the accumulation of garbage floating in the ocean, which are known as Great Pacific Garbage Patches, and garbage patches in other areas as well. It is thought by the year 2050 that the amount of plastics in the ocean will actually outweigh all of the fish in the oceans. About 200 million tons of plastic are thought to be in the ocean now. And as I said, as these plastics gradually get broken down, there are problems. Large plastics can be ingested by sea life. So for example, sea turtles can feed on jellyfish. Wet plastic bags can look like jellyfish. And so many marine organisms then ingest plastics thinking that they are food items, perhaps jellyfish, and then choke that way. But then the plastics, as they degrade into tiny particles, they can enter food chains through filter feeders and small microorganisms. And so then microplastics work their way into fish and then the larger animals which eat fish. So the contamination of these various plastics can affect marine life in multiple ways. Now, there are many types of waste. Plastic is one type of waste. Another type of waste is known as green waste. This is the waste of food, which is not eaten. And when one compares the amount of wasted food, it's evident that we are not as efficient as we could be. And so, many foods perish, and so therefore there are perishable dates, after which point, the vegetables may go bad, the milk may go bad, etc. It's been estimated that about a third of all of the food produced in the world is actually not consumed. So that trash must then include about 1.3 billion tons of green waste per year. Different countries produce of this green waste. The United States is responsible for more than the average. So in a year, the average person in North America and Europe, it averages to be about 100 kilograms. And so more than someone's body weight could easily then be discarded in wasted food per year. Now, this isn't just wasted food, but think of the gasoline which was used to sow the seeds. Think of the gasoline which was used to harvest it, the water which was used to water these crops, the pesticides which were spread. And so this has a large impact. There are a lot of wasted aspects in the production of this food. The land area needed to grow this wasted food is more than the land area of the United States. And the water needed to grow this wasted food is 30 times the amount of water used by households. And so if we could cut down on green, then it would save, fight climate change, different foods that are amounts. And so it takes far more energy, far more water to produce, say, a kilogram than it does a vegetable plant. So 1 kilogram of beef can use 50 times can be used to produce 50 times more of that. And so agricultural will have a far heavier amount of waste. There are many types of waste, and electronics playing a larger role. Electronics not only include phones and televisions, but there are electronic aspects to refrigerators, to water engines, etc. And so the waste of electronics is known as e-waste, or electronic waste, is a growing problem. Refrigerators, washing machines, all of them, and many of these are 5% of global waste, and that percentage is an estimated 40 million tons per year per person. And so this is a breakdown of various categories. Medical waste is the leading category of refrigerators, computers, and cell phones also play roles. And notice that in general, the trend is that they are increasing over time. One of the problems which contributes is built-in obsolescence. Many of these products are not meant to be eternal. You're not meant to keep using this year's computer or phone or television. And so the marketing of the latest brand means that the shorter the lifespan of these electronic components, the more waste which will be generated. Now, there is a market to recycle this e-waste, given all of the various valuable components, which I will point out in just a second. And so while this can be discarded into landfills, there is a great potential to recycle e-waste, given the number of metals which are found, which I list here. So the more metals which can be recycled from e-waste, the less which will be needed to be mined, and produce using a lot of water. And also notice that there's aluminum, mercury, beryllium, aluminum, and others. It is great that these will be recycled from e-waste. This is now also a potential problem in that these metals can then offer exposure to toxic chemicals to those who are working in refineries, and then it can contaminate those who live nearby. After oil from it, but unfortunately, this produces a number of chemicals which can be carcinogenic, which can be teratogens, which cause birth defects, which can cause damage to immune and reproductive systems. Many, as I'll go through, mimic to e-waste. About a quarter of protection for workers. And that is wonderful, but that means that 3/4 of the e-waste is not recycled in this way. So metal, this is something with urban ore, where, for example, the gold from e-waste can approximate 10% of what is mined, and therefore the scrap industry can actually gain a lot of money by recovering these valuable metals. And as pointed out here, if you were to recycle 1 million cell phones, you could find 35,000 pounds of copper, 772 pounds of silver, and 72 pounds of gold. So the positive in this recycling is that certainly there are valuable elements which could be recovered, and this will cut down on waste. The darker side is that these elements can then pollute the environment. Now, when we look at e-waste, it's not evenly distributed throughout. China is here in millions, and you can see the very. So then a problem with e-waste then is it can travel from some countries to others, that some of the countries which are dealing with the hazardous products of this e-waste are not the countries which produced it. And so, some countries may accept e-waste because their workers can then, separate all those valuable elements, but this then exposes the workers to hazardous work conditions and hazardous chemicals. And so conditions at landfills can be non-standard. There can be workers who receive little protection, and while they may have the benefit of working for earnings which are higher than minimum salary, hazards may include cancer, respiratory illness, death from landfill collapse. And because some of these toxic elements can then enter groundwater, etc., they often then contaminate the neighboring towns and villages, and so affecting the health of the elderly living nearby, even if they are workers in the recycling centers. There is a consideration, and obviously this can then go into the air and have broader range effects. Now, there are solutions to this where companies try to cut down on the waste, which is not try to make things with in obsolescence that allow for the flow back from after the use of these, which so that the companies which are making these electronic products can then make them in a way which minimize e-waste, and then their downstream solution where things can be managed better there. And so solutions include toxic chemicals, increasing of products, improving the ability to be repaired rather than discarded, increase the amount of recyclable material in it. And downstream solutions is to decrease illegal trade in waste, improve ways of recycling back to producers, and improve recycling procedures. There are many other types of waste which can be encountered, one of which is pesticides. Right, and so pests are a problem because many foods spoil because of fungi, of viruses, of insects. And so thus, if pests could be eliminated, then less food would have to be grown. And so there's a good case to be made for pesticides. Certainly, certain pesticides, such as those which kill mosquitoes, have helped to limit the spread of diseases such as malaria, and have had an enormous positive effect on human life. Unfortunately, there are also then problems with pesticides, that many insects develop a resistance to it very quickly, that pesticides can kill species other than the intended species, and that pesticides can become more concentrated as one goes up the food chain. And so if small microorganisms absorb pesticides, then the animals which eat them, such as small aquatic invertebrates, they will then have higher levels of pesticides in them than the original microorganisms. Then the fish which feed on those invertebrates will have a higher level still, or then the birds, the mammals, and even then the humans which feed on the fish will have higher levels still. So this is what is known as biomagnification, where these chemicals then increase in their concentration up the food chain, and it's individuals which are at higher levels of the food chain, including humans, which then have the greatest levels of these in them. Why are these chemicals dangerous? So whether it be from e-waste or from plastics, here. One of the issue, let's just talk about cancer. Sometimes certain things in chemicals can signal cells. So let's take, for example, estrogen. Estrogen is a signal which can tell cells to divide more quickly, say cells of the breast. The problem is if there's too much of an estrogenic signal, then that could then artificially stimulate cells to divide more often than they should. And that could then promote cancerous growth. And it turns out that some of the pesticides we use are meant to disrupt the hormones of bugs. All right, but unfortunately, then they can then affect our hormones as well. So some pesticides are estrogenic. Some elements in plastics, such as bisphenol A or BPA, are estrogenic, so that they can trigger the estrogen receptors in cells to then be fooled into thinking that the receptor actually bound estrogen. And then it tells the cell, hey, I've just bound estrogen, it's time to divide. When the reality is the estrogen receptor did not bind estrogen. It bound something in plastics like bisphenol A, or it bound something in a pesticide which was estrogenic. And so therefore cell division rates and thus the chance of mutation can then increase because of elements which are in plastics and the like. Now, I teach a class in genetics, and so I can certainly get into greater detail on mutations, and I have some videos that do. Suffice it to say that there are many different kinds of mutations, and thus there are different ways that chemicals can then cause mutations and then increase the risk of cancer. And so while many chemicals may be carcinogens promoting cancer, they may promote cancer in different ways. They may cause nucleotides to break. They may break DNA chains. So chemicals can do this, X-rays can do this. That could then cause chromosomes to break, and then part to be lost. There are certain chemicals which look like DNA nucleotides and can get inserted into DNA chains instead of DNA. And there are chemicals which can cause the insertion of new new nucleotides or the deletion of new nucleotides. And so the chemicals which are coming from the plastics, the chemicals which are being ingested after being incinerated, they can cause mutations in a number of different ways. So it is often noted that cancer cells have abnormal numbers of chromosomes. This would make the cells abnormal because then the number of genes they would have would be abnormal. And there are a number of chemicals which can do this. So heavy metals can cause breakages in chromosomes. That's one of the reasons, that it is a potential concern that we use aluminum salts in deodorants, because aluminum salts can actually then work their way into the skin, where then they can cause mutations, such as abnormal numbers of chromosomes. And some studies have pointed to a larger than random number of breast cancers are in what's called the upper outer quadrant, which faces the armpit, where these deodorants and these aluminum salts are used. And so, things which cause chromosomes to break can then be problematic. And just then in general, a cancer cell is by definition abnormal. And so anything that promotes abnormalities in cells can cause abnormal growth. So in these two cells, if one were a cancer cell, or a cancer cell in one patient versus another, one could see that many proteins are expressed at abnormal levels in cancer cells. All right, and so notice The normal cell may have proteins which cancer cells lack. Cancer cells may have proteins which normal cells lack, etc. And there are many ways in which chemicals can cause then differences. And so some chemicals simulate hormones, such as estrogenic hormones, which would tell cells to divide. Some chemicals cause mutations. Some chemicals cause chromosomes to break, which would then result in cells which have abnormal numbers of chromosomes and thus abnormal gene expression. And so this was just an introduction into many of the diverse effects that chemicals and our disposal of our chemicals in our waste can then affect the environment and affect human health.